And good morning again, everyone. Welcome to April. Happy April 1st. It's April Fool's Day, of course, if you're not familiar with that. Unfortunately, what we're living through isn't an April Fool's, but we're going to try to get through it as best we can anyway. Thank you again for tuning in to AP U.S. History virtual version. Today, we're going to spend a little time looking at another step forward in Unit 8. My name is Mr. Horton. I teach at Williamsville South High School, just outside of Buffalo, New York, home of the Buffalo Bills. And if you have questions, one of the things we've added to this since last Friday is a Twitter page at @virtualapush. You can tweet questions that you have to that Twitter handle, and we'd be glad to answer those. Thank you to Cynthia Pickles out there who gave us a nice shout out on her Twitter just a little while ago. So I was just checking those over. So if you haven't been woken up yet today, so that's from a very famous movie about the Vietnam War, and of course stars Robin Williams. So good morning again to everyone. So the question that was left over from yesterday, or the review question, I should say, was this question: the different point of view between President Eisenhower and President John Kennedy about the buildup of American armed forces. So I'll just give you a minute to read through those and try to see if you can identify the difference between the two. We're going to hit that topic a couple of times today. So if you look at the two documents here, Eisenhower, of course, in 1961 is leaving the presidency, and his point of view is that the buildup of the military has been a dangerous thing, ultimately, that the connection between the military and defense industries and government-funded university research is what he's also talking about here, although he doesn't specifically mention that. That these are things, as he says, we must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. So he's kind of cautioning the United States, much like Washington would caution the United States way back when he left the presidency in 1797 with his farewell address. So Eisenhower is issuing a warning about the influence of that buildup of the military. On the other side here, John F. Kennedy, who's running for the presidency in 1960, gives us the opposite point of view. We must step up crash programs on the ultimate weapon, submarines and Minuteman missiles, etc., as he talks about here. So he's obviously advocating for a buildup of the military. And the context of that is of course very important. Kennedy wants to show that he's strong on foreign policy, and so that's part of the reason why he's saying what he's saying here. So two presidents, obviously Eisenhower leaving the White House and giving us this warning about the buildup of the military, and a young man trying to enter into the presidency, giving us his point of view on that very same question. So we'll start with a quick warm-up question. This is a great Dr. Seuss cartoon. See if you can figure out what the point of view about appeasement is in this cartoon. So of course we don't have the cat in the hat here, but we have something somewhat similar anyway. This is a great Dr. Seuss cartoon who got his start doing political cartoons in the 1930s, and this was of course one of them. So the point of view here is that appeasement is equal to weakness, is essentially what his implication here is in this cartoon. So if you recall, appeasement is giving into a dictator with the thinking that by giving a dictator what they want, that we'll be able to stop them from taking anything else. The specific specific reference, of course, is to Adolf Hitler in the 1930s in this cartoon. And this is an important sort of way to set up what we're going to talk about today, because containment, as I mentioned in an earlier episode, is the opposite of this. Containment was the policy of the United States to step up and stand up against the expansion of dictators. In the Cold War period, of course, we're referring to Stalin. So the point of view here, of course, is that America should not be appeasing Hitler, that we should be standing up to Adolf Hitler in the 1930s, which was not a majority opinion until much later in the decade, actually not until really Pearl Harbor. So our overview for today, we're going to look at topic 8.7 and topic 8.8, America's role in the world during the Cold War. We're going to focus on interpreting political cartoons. You're going to see a lot of those in here as we talk about some of the specific examples of America's increased role in the world during the period, and then give you a political cartoon to think about. What is the cartoonist trying to tell us here? What is their point of view, which is really what the focus will be on a lot of these. And before we get into that, I just want to remind you to remember, with political cartoons, don't take things literally. There's often a lot of sarcasm and irony being used in cartoons. So keep that in mind as we go through some of the cartoons in a little while. What you should already know, how America's role in the world changed from imperialism through World War II. In an earlier episode, I talked a little bit about the early events of the Cold War, the Truman Doctrine, for example, the Marshall Plan, for example, the formation of NATO. So those are also backgrounds to the 1960s, which is really what we're going to focus on today as the Cold War continues on in John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson's presidencies. And you should also know how to analyze arguments in secondary sources. We will get to some secondary sources a little bit later in the presentation here. So the overriding question, how did America take on a leading role in the world during the Cold War? And of course, the Cold War during the 60s is the focus of this. And at the end of the lesson, you should understand the ways America became involved, and also how those events are reflected in some of the political cartoons that we're going to take a look at. So again, if you're just joining us, we have a Twitter handle @virtualapush. You can go ahead and tweet questions to that. My partner in crime here, Ms. Farr, is manning the Twitter today and answering questions while we're doing presentations. So take just a couple of minutes to read through these two documents, one from 1964 on the left and one from 1973, and see if you can figure out what the difference between those two documents is. So hopefully you've had a chance to read through a little bit of each of those two things. The document on the left is 1964, and at the bottom, if you read it at the bottom half of that document, it says the Congress approves and supports the determination of the president to take all necessary measures to repel armed attack against the forces of the U.S. So this is a very large grant of power to the president, to the executive, chief executive, at the beginning of the Vietnam War in 1964. And then when you look at the other document, which is just 9 years later, you can see that that document is putting limits on the power of the president to wage that war. So one of the things, hopefully, that you'll think about as we go through some of the Vietnam War stuff, which is the first main topic, is why this might change. Why would Congress sort of change its mind about how much power it's granted to the president? And was Vietnam really the reason for that? And I think you'll see that it was. So two quick questions here for you on this one. What is the point of view of this cartoonist? What is the connection the cartoonist is making between the Korean and the Vietnam Wars? All right, so our timer's up here. So hopefully you noticed that on the in the cartoon that Uncle Sam, who of course represents the United States, is trying to plug the hole in the dike, which is holding back the water there. But as he's doing that, of course, there's another hole that springs in the dike in Indochina there, and you see that it's labeled communist aggression coming through that second hole there. So America's struggling to do the job of keeping back the two efforts at communist expansion in this period. And the connection, of course, is that the cartoonist is trying to make a connection between containing communism in Korea and containing communism in Indochina or Vietnam. And it's an important thing to keep in mind, because I think American policymakers saw those two wars as very similar. And I'm going to make the argument that they are not similar in a lot of ways. And you'll see that as we talk about some of the things here. So here's a short clip on the beginning of the Vietnam War.
The Gulf of Tonkin Incident, 1964, the Vietnam War. The Gulf of Tonkin Incident, or the USS Maddox Incident, is the event responsible for America's entry into the Vietnam War. Vietnam was divided into halves, North and South, ruled by separate regimes, but the United States were concerned that Ho Chi Minh and the Communists would win the upcoming elections and were determined to stop the spread of communism. U.S. military involvement, however, had been minimal until 1964. President Lyndon B. Johnson had been training South Vietnamese mercenaries, sending them into North Vietnam to carry out acts of sabotage and gather intel. On July 31, 1964, South Vietnamese commandos had attacked North Vietnamese targets in the Gulf of Tonkin. On August 2, 1964, American naval destroyers had moved into North Vietnam waters to gather intelligence on the enemy's naval strength. The USS Maddox was nearing the mouth of the river delta when Captain Herrick noticed that they were being followed by North Vietnamese torpedo boats and had intercepted communications of their intention to attack, so he fired 3 warning shots. The USS Maddox was then fired upon by the enemy torpedo boats. Captain Herrick retaliated and opened fire on the torpedo boats, and with the assistance of U.S. jet fighters, hit all 3 enemy targets. The enemy boats had fired their torpedoes, but they all missed. The USS Maddox then retreated back into international waters. 2 days later, a second patrol was launched into the Gulf of Tonkin by the USS Maddox and the USS Turner Joy, when Captain Herrick reported that they were again under attack. Secretary McNamara and President Johnson agreed that retaliation was needed and the expansion of the war was approved by Congress. However, Herrick sent a later message claiming that he was mistaken about the attack and that freak weather action may have led his men to overreact. The final part of the message read, "No actual visual sightings by Maddox. Suggest complete evaluation before any further action taken." Nevertheless, this was ignored by Johnson and his advisors, who continued on with the retaliation plan. On August 5th, Johnson made a public speech stating, "The determination of all Americans to carry out our full commitment to the people and to the government of South Vietnam will be redoubled by this outrage." Shortly after his speech, U.S. aircraft bombed North Vietnamese targets, torpedo boat bases, and an oil storage depot. America was now drawn into the Vietnam War. President Johnson made a speech via the media to the American people to get their support for the war, and described the attack on 2 U.S. Navy warships as a deliberate aggression. By late 1965, 200,000 American troops were on the ground, with more on the way.
Okay, so if you think about that, the document that we started with, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, that's exactly what this is in reference to. This incident that takes place in the Gulf of Tonkin over the course of 2 days in August of 1964. And Johnson goes before Congress and asks for permission to fight back against what he called this act of aggression. So, and of course, Congress will then pass the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which President Johnson, in his always colorful way of describing things, referred to it as being like grandma's nightshirt because it covered everything, meaning that it gave him power to do whatever it was that he wanted to do. So the background of the Vietnam War, without getting too far into the weeds here, is that Vietnam had always resisted the control of outsiders, going back to the Chinese controlling Vietnam for almost 1,000 years. The French colonized the region in the 1800s. During World War II, II. The Japanese take over this region of the world, as they did much of the Pacific Rim. And in the post-World War II period, the French return and try to reestablish their colony in Vietnam. So the French are trying to kind of go back to the way things were before World War II, and the Vietnamese people form an organization called the Viet Minh, which was a nationalist organization formed to resist foreign control of their country. So this is part of a greater trend that you'll see in the 1945 period. And in that period, there's what we would call decolonization, that the colonial empires that have been created by European powers throughout the world in the late 1800s begin to come apart, and people in those places begin to resist. And this is an example of that. So the causes of the Vietnam War, to put it very simply, the U.S. wanted to contain communism. This, of course, is a theme from much of the Cold War, containing the spread of communism. In this case, they saw Vietnam as the beginning of, as Eisenhower referred to it, the domino that could knock over the rest of the dominoes in that region, Southeast Asia. He refers to this, of course, as the domino theory. And as I mentioned before, American policymakers read this very similar to Korea. The communist-backed forces have attacked the non-communist forces, and therefore the U.S. needs to step in and do something about that, like what had happened in Korea. America was concerned that communists would win the upcoming elections in Vietnam, and you saw that in the video clip that we just took a look at here. Ho Chi Minh, who was the leader of the communists, was very popular because he expressed not only communist but nationalist views that Vietnam should control its own destiny. Interestingly, Ho Chi Minh actually wrote a letter to President Truman way back in 1946 requesting American help in gaining their independence, and actually modeled the Declaration of Independence after the American Declaration of Independence. So there's some blurring of the line between whether this is a communist thing or a nationalist thing or some blend of both of those things. And of course, the Gulf of Tonkin attacks that we just saw about a minute ago. Now, as the war goes on, there are some questions about the war. So I'll give you a minute to, again, try to figure out what the point of view of this cartoonist is. Okay, so time's up there. So one of the important things with cartoons, I think students sometimes forget to read the title or the caption of the cartoon, because it often leads to some important clues in the cartoon. So here it says 9 blind men and the tiger, and you'll notice that all around the tiger there's 9 different statements. And each of those statements seems to be an answer to what is going on in Vietnam. So the tiger is labeled communist aggression, and you see all around them, there's all different answers to what that is. North Vietnam is expressing its independence. It's a boundary dispute between North and South. It's a protest against U.S. imperialism, etc. So there's some confusion here, or some confusion about what the war really means. And is it a civil war between North and South Vietnam? Is it a civil war between communists and non-communists? What exactly is happening here is really the question that is being raised by the cartoonist here. So as the war drags along here, the video did a nice job of sort of very quickly summarizing that initially it starts as an air war where the United States Air Force is bombing targets mostly in North Vietnam. And eventually in 1965, March of 1965, American troops are landed in Vietnam. And gradually the troops' numbers will build up and build up and build up and build up. And unfortunately, victory doesn't seem to be anywhere in sight. And these are two photographs of President Johnson in the Situation Room, and you can see the total exasperation on his face, trying to figure out what the right thing to do is with the war. So there are two schools of thought. One is to go all the way and try to win the war, and the other is to withdraw completely. And somewhere in between there is where Lyndon Johnson ultimately ended up falling. So we would add some troops, and then we'd try to figure out a way out, and then add some more troops and figure out a way out. And things didn't seem to be going well. In 1968, there's a turning point in the war, and that is what's called the Tet Offensive. It happens on the New Year's holiday in January, which traditionally in the war was a time of a ceasefire. And you can see from the map here that these are major American military installations throughout South Vietnam that were attacked in January of 1968. So the federal government had been telling the American people that the war was being won. And in 1968, when this happens, it showed that, of course, the Viet Cong, the communist sympathizers in the South, and the North Vietnamese were not anywhere near defeat. They certainly were not anywhere near giving up. And so it began to made people begin to question what was really happening in Vietnam and how much longer, how much further was that going to be going on. So in March of that same year, it's of course an election year in 1968, Lyndon Johnson stops the bombing campaign, as he had several times before during the war effort. He would stop bombing and pursue peace talks, and those would typically not bear fruition. Then they would go back to bombing and increase the troop levels, and around the cycle again we would go. But at the end of a broadcast on March 31st of that year, Lyndon Johnson announced that he would not run for the presidency in 1968, and the main reason for that is the Vietnam War. He, of course, was bearing more and more of the blame for not making much progress there. So this is a political cartoon showing Lyndon Johnson, and we'll get to the question that goes with that in just a moment. But the image in the upper left is a famous story about Lyndon Johnson. He loved to show off his gallbladder surgery scar, and you can see him here pointing that out to reporters in the actual photograph. So that's one of the references in the cartoon that might make things a little bit easier to understand when we look at that cartoon. So two quick questions here for you on this one. What is the symbolism in the cartoon? So what are some things that you notice there that might be symbolically important? And what's the message or the argument of the cartoon? And time is up. So for symbolism, hopefully you notice that his nose is quite elongated in this image, which of course is designed to evoke the image of Pinocchio, who didn't often tell the truth. And maybe you notice that the scar is shaped like Vietnam. So they're making a reference to this famous incident where Lyndon Johnson showed off his surgery scar. And in this case, of course, the scar is shaped like South Vietnam. And the message, one message or argument that you could infer from the cartoon is that the war is, quote, literally scarring Lyndon Johnson and his policies. It's hurting him and his presidency because the longer it goes on, the less support there seems to be for that war. So in 1969, when Nixon becomes president, he wins the election of 1968. There's some division among the Democratic Party over the issue of the war. And Nixon will eventually expand the war to Cambodia. So the image that you see here is him explaining that to reporters that we're going to send incursions into Cambodia to try to stop the flow of supplies into South Vietnam. And many Americans felt like that he was violating his campaign promise that he was going to end the war, and instead here he was expanding that. So that led to even more anti-war protests, and I'm going to leave that topic really to Ms. Farr. She'll talk about those things a little bit tomorrow. But Nixon promised to end the war through a policy he called Vietnamization. And what that basically meant was that American troops would be withdrawn and be replaced by Vietnamese troops. So America could begin the drawdown of American forces in that region. So that was his promise, and that's why people felt that he maybe had betrayed that promise. And the war eventually will end in 1973 with a peace agreement. Last American troops left Vietnam in March of 1973, and shortly thereafter is when the War Powers Act was passed. So that's the document that we started with, the second document that we started with. So I'll give you a minute to answer these two questions about a graphic about the Vietnam War. So hopefully you notice the trend here of an increase of troops from the year 1960 to 1968. So sometimes it's helpful to divide the chart or the graph up into different segments or pieces. So here, if you drew a line all the way across the 1968 year, you could see that there's an increase up to that year, each year steadily going up and up and up and up. And then of course, after 1968, there is a decrease from year to year. So kind of a nice bell curve here in a lot of ways. So that's the trend, of course, the increase in troops up until 1968. And so a question on the AP might ask you, why did American troop levels begin changing, or what's the historical context behind this? And there's two potential answers for that that I just covered in the presentation just a minute or two ago. The Tet Offensive caused Americans to question our involvement. You see 1968 is the peak of our involvement. That also was the beginning of that year, was the Tet Offensive, which happens in January of 1968. And Nixon winning the presidency and beginning the policy of Vietnamization is another reason why that trend begins to go in the opposite direction that you see there in the second half or the bottom half of the graph. So just to revisit that question, what's the difference between the two documents? The Gulf of Tonkin is at the beginning of the Vietnam War, granting President Johnson all the power he needs, all necessary measures, as it says here directly in the document, to repel armed attacks. So America could begin the bombing of North Vietnam. America could send over 500,000 troops ultimately into that nation without congressional approval. And the War Powers Act at the end of that war, of course, is limiting the president's ability to do that. And the Vietnam War is a big part of the reason for that. There was a growing concern about the extension of power of the executive branch of the federal government. And so this was a way to put limits on that in this thing called the War Powers Act. Kind of just talked you through those things. So. All right, so a quick check for understanding here. Let's try a political cartoon that's not necessarily about Vietnam. So what is the role of the third world, Asia, Africa, Latin America, in the Cold War, according to this cartoonist? And think about the symbolism here. So hopefully, if you take a look here, this is a great cartoon. There's some really great symbolism in here. So on the left-hand side, you have Uncle Sam, who seems to be reaching around or putting his arms around all these different regions of the world. Africa is under his left arm, and of course, his right arm is reaching into Asia there. And if you notice, there's a very small little bear here, which of course the bear typically represents the Soviet Union. But on the other side, you have the Soviet Union, the large bear here, and he is of course reaching into those very same places with a little Uncle Sam sort of in front of the globe. So the implication of the cartoon is that these regions became areas of competition between the US and USSR during the Cold War. In an earlier episode, we talked about the split in Europe between Eastern and Western Europe. And so of course the Cold War then extends into these other places, and Vietnam is no exception to that. Korea is a good example of that we covered in an earlier lesson here. So we're going to take a look at one quick example from Cuba. Again, a short film clip here for you.
War. As the United States and Soviet Union faced off across the globe, each knew that the other had nuclear weapons capable of destroying it. And destruction never loomed closer than during the 13 days of the Cuban Missile Crisis. In 1961, the U.S. unsuccessfully tried to overthrow Cuba's new communist government. That failed attempt was known as the Bay of Pigs, and it convinced Cuba to seek help from the USSR. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev was happy to comply by secretly deploying nuclear missiles to Cuba, not only to protect the island, but to counteract the threat from U.S. missiles in Italy and Turkey. By the time U.S. intelligence discovered the plan, the materials to create the missiles were already in place. At an emergency meeting on October 16, 1962, military advisors urged an airstrike on missile sites and invasion of the island. But President John F. Kennedy chose a more careful approach. On October 22, he announced that the U.S. Navy would intercept all shipments to Cuba. There was just one problem. A naval blockade was considered an act of war. Although the president called it a quarantine that did not block basic necessities, the Soviets didn't appreciate the distinction. In an outraged letter to Kennedy, Khrushchev wrote, "The violation of freedom to use international waters and international airspace is an act of aggression which pushes mankind toward the abyss of world nuclear missile war." Thus ensued the most intense 6 days of the Cold War. While the U.S. demanded the removal of the missiles, Cuba and the USSR insisted they were only defensive. And as the weapons continued to be armed, the U.S. prepared for a possible invasion. On October 27th, a spy plane piloted by Major Rudolf Anderson was shot down by a Soviet missile. The same day, a nuclear-armed Soviet submarine was hit by a small depth charge from a U.S. Navy vessel trying to signal it to come up. The commanders on the sub, too deep to communicate with the surface, thought war had begun and prepared to launch a nuclear torpedo. That decision had to be made unanimously by 3 officers. The captain and political officer both authorized the launch, but Vasily Arkhipov, second in command, refused. His decision saved the day, and perhaps the world. But the crisis wasn't over. For the first time in history, the U.S. military set itself to DEFCON 2, the defense readiness one step away from nuclear war. With hundreds of nuclear missiles ready to launch, the metaphorical doomsday clock stood at 1 minute to midnight. But diplomacy carried on. In Washington, D.C., Attorney General Robert Kennedy secretly met with Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin. After intense negotiation, they reached the following proposal. The U.S. would remove their missiles from Turkey and Italy and promise to never invade Cuba in exchange for the Soviet withdrawal from Cuba under UN inspection. Once the meeting had concluded, Dobrynin cabled Moscow, saying time is of the essence and we shouldn't miss the chance. And at 9 a.m. the next day, a message arrived from Khrushchev announcing the Soviet missiles would be removed from Cuba. The crisis was now over. While criticized at the time by their respective governments for bargaining with the enemy, contemporary historical analysis shows great admiration for Kennedy and Khrushchev's ability to diplomatically solve the crisis. But the disturbing lesson was that a slight communication error or split-second decision by a commander could have thwarted all their efforts, as it nearly did, if not for Vasily Arkhipov's courageous choice. The Cuban Missile Crisis revealed just how fragile human politics are compared to the terrifying power they can unleash.
Okay.
War.
So we have two things going on there, two major events there. So we'll take a minute to try to interpret this cartoon. I gave you a big hint here in the question. So hopefully you noticed if you looked very closely at this, that the cigar that has just exploded here is labeled Cuba and Castro. And of course, the Bay of Pigs is the reference in the cartoon, which is, in this case, literally blown up in his face. They're sort of making fun of a supposed CIA plot to kill Castro by inserting explosives in his cigar. So there's a little context for you on the cartoon here as well. But the invasion hurt President Kennedy, certainly embarrassed his administration, which is the main point of view of the cartoon here. Let's try this one. What's the point of view of this cartoonist? So again, if you look carefully at the cartoon here, the cartoonist is suggesting that, of course, there's an arm wrestling match happening here. But if you look carefully, the free hands of each of those two leaders is hovered over a button, which is wired into the weapon that is sitting underneath the opposite person there. So this is a cartoon that refers to the Cuban Missile Crisis, the closest the world ever came to World War III. And thankfully, between those two, who are literally sweating it out here in the cartoon, eventually there was a peaceful resolution of that. But this is a good example, again, of how the Cold War spread from beyond Europe. We talked about Vietnam and the decolonization of Vietnam and how that plays a part in the Cold War. And of course, here in Latin America, Cuba is maybe the most famous example of a region in the 60s that becomes a Cold War battleground in many ways between the Soviets and the United States. And it also might imply that the two men are locked in a struggle that they find difficult to find a way out of, that there doesn't seem to be a winner if both of them end up pushing the button here and launching a nuclear war, which thankfully didn't happen in 1962. So an example from Europe that happens during the 60s, we'll watch again a quick short clip here.
In the early hours of August 13, 1961, East German construction workers, flanked by soldiers and police, began tearing up streets and erecting barriers throughout the city of Berlin and its surroundings. This night marked the beginning of one of history's most infamous dividing lines, the Berlin Wall. Construction on the wall continued for the next decade as it cut through neighborhoods, separated families, and divided not just Germany, but the world. To understand how we got to this point, we have to go back to World War II. America, Britain, and France joined forces with the Soviet Union against the Axis powers. After they defeated Nazi Germany, each of the victorious nations occupied part of the country. The division was meant to be temporary, but the former allies found themselves at odds over their visions for post-war Europe. While Western powers promoted liberal market economies, the Soviet Union sought to surround itself with obedient communist nations, including a weakened Germany. As their relations deteriorated, the Federal Republic of Germany was formed in the West, while the Soviets established the German Democratic Republic in the East. The Soviet satellite countries restricted Western trade and movement, so a virtually impassable border formed. It became known as the Iron Curtain. In the former German capital of Berlin, things were particularly complicated. Although the city lay fully within the East German territory of the GDR, the post-war agreement gave the Allies joint administration. So America, Britain, and France created a democratic enclave in Berlin's western districts. While East Germans were officially banned from leaving the country, in Berlin, it was simply a matter of walking or riding a subway, streetcar, or bus to the western half, then traveling on to West Germany or beyond. This open border posed a problem for the East German leadership. They had staked a claim to represent the communist resistance against Hitler and portrayed Western Germany as a continuation of the Nazi regime. While the US and its allies poured money into West Germany's reconstruction, the Soviet Union extracted resources from the East as war reparations, making its planned economy even less competitive. Life in East Germany passed under the watchful eye of the Stasi, the secret police whose wiretaps and informants monitored citizens for any hint of disloyalty. While there was free healthcare and education in the East, the West boasted higher salaries, more consumer goods, and greater personal freedom. By 1961, about 3.5 million people, nearly 20% of the East German population, had left, including many young professionals. To prevent further losses, East Germany decided to close the border, and that's where the Berlin Wall came in. Extending for 43 kilometers through Berlin and a further 112 through East Germany, the initial barrier consisted of barbed wire and mesh fencing. Some Berliners escaped by jumping over the wire or leaping from windows, but as the wall expanded, this became more difficult. By 1965, 106 kilometers of 3.6-meter-high concrete barricades had been added, topped with a smooth pipe to prevent climbing. Over the coming years, the barrier was strengthened with spike strips, guard dogs, and even landmines, along with 302 watchtowers and 20 bunkers. A parallel fence in the rear set off a 100-meter area called the Death Strip. There, all buildings were demolished and the ground covered with sand to provide a clear line of sight for the hundreds of guards ordered to shoot anyone attempting to cross. Nevertheless, nearly 5,000 people in total managed to flee East Germany between 1961 and 1989. Some were diplomats or athletes who defected while abroad, but others were ordinary citizens who dug tunnels, swam across canals, flew hot air balloons, or even crashed a stolen tank through the wall. Yet the risk was great. Over 138 people died while attempting escape, some shot in full view of West Germans powerless to help them. The wall stabilized East Germany's economy by preventing its workforce from leaving, but tarnished its reputation, becoming a global symbol of communist repression.
Okay, so again, another major issue that President Kennedy is going to have to deal with in the 1960s is Berlin in Europe, in the heart of Europe, actually in East Germany, as you can see from this map. So West Berlin becomes this sort of little island of democracy and capitalism behind the Iron Curtain. So it was very important symbolically in the Cold War. And the question was, what could we do about that? So President Kennedy goes to Berlin, flies to West Berlin, and gives a very famous speech at that wall where he says all free citizens of the world are citizens of Berlin. He's indicating to the people of West Berlin that the rest of the world is with you. And he very famously says, "Ich bin ein Berliner," I am a Berliner, in that speech. And there will be another very famous speech that takes place at that wall in the 1980s, and I'll cover that one in a little bit later segment when Ronald Reagan goes. So take a minute just to see if you can figure out what the point of view of this cartoonist is regarding the Berlin Wall. All right. So hopefully you noticed that, or that this might be one potential answer for that. The cartoonist is using irony to point out that the wall is really more about keeping people in than it is to keep people out. Many people died trying to cross that barrier. You can see the arms of people hanging down from the top of that wall there. And he's being ironic here. So again, remember when you look at political cartoons to not take them literally all the time. And it's Khrushchev, who is the Soviet leader there, saying, see how many people are staying here? And of course, the intention there is to be ironic because people are staying because they're forced to stay there. So to debrief, how did America take a leading role in the world during the Cold War? Many different ways. Military intervention in Korea and in Vietnam. So we covered the Korean War in an earlier segment. Vietnam is the main focus of the first half of today. The quarantine of Cuba, and ultimately the showdown with the Soviet Union during what was called the Cuban Missile Crisis in October of 1962. Assisting in the support of regimes that were not always democratic. So the United States would support countries and leaders that were anti-communist, and whether they were democratic or not seemed to take a second seat. It really wasn't as important. Resisting the takeover of Berlin, and again, we talked about today the Berlin Wall, a little example of that. Financial assistance to non-communist nations. While we didn't talk about that specifically here, aiding non-communist nations in places like Africa and in Asia through economic aid would be another way that the U.S. would fight the Cold War. We referred to that actually in an earlier segment. And competing in the arms and space race against the USSR, which is referred to in that opening document, the Eisenhower versus Kennedy documents. Americans debated many aspects of these involvements as the 60s wore on, and you'll learn more about these things as well tomorrow. But Americans debated several things. One, to what extent should the United States build up its military and industrial power? That was the topic really of the Kennedy and Eisenhower speeches that we looked at the very beginning of the lesson. How much power should the president be given in foreign policy? So again, a great example of that is the Gulf of Tonkin resolution that we talked about in comparison with the War Powers resolution, where the president's power is being reined back in. And that's a question that always is asked in situations. How much power should the president have? How much limit should be put on the power of the presidency? And then nations in the Middle East and Africa and Latin America, how can we make them our allies? And there's different ways, of course, of doing that. Let's try a quick practice here. I know we're running up against the time limit here. So here's a cartoon from the Vietnam War. So I know it seems tempting to go for that decolonization in Asia, but the best answer here, of course, is containment of communism. So that's what the pursuit of the policy is here. That policy goal is to contain communism in Asia, not to decolonize it. Of course, the U.S. actually takes the opposite position in Vietnam. Okay, let's try this one. So again, while B looks like a good answer for this, it's actually the best answer is D, the debate over the Vietnam War. You see the soldier escalating up a staircase that leads ultimately off of a cliff, and the other person there burying their head in the sand, saying we should be completely out of that. So, and here's a good example of where context is really important. So if you weren't sure whether this was Korea or Vietnam, if you look in the copyright, it's the 1960s, and hopefully you would remember that Korea happens in the 1950s, not the 1960s, and that would eliminate that answer. So understanding context of these things is important as well when you look at sources. Okay, let's try this question. This asks you to make a connection to the 19th century. All right, so this is a great question asking you to make some connections here. And what's important is to keep in mind the theme. The theme of this cartoon is America in the world. What is America's appropriate role in the world? So being involved in Vietnam or not being involved in Vietnam is the essence of the question. So once you know that, I think it becomes a lot more obvious that A is the answer to the question. In the late 19th century, there were questions about whether the United States was justified in acquiring new territory, especially after the Spanish-American War, which we'll get to in a review segment a little bit later. But again, keep in mind the theme here that is happening there. So thank you again for watching us today. Hopefully you tune in tomorrow, where Ms. Farr will take us into the Great Society and some of the student movement of that period. And we hope you'll join us again as we air every single day at 11 a.m. right here on YouTube, of course. I'll leave you with a practice question, and that question is to think about what was the changing role of the federal government in the New Deal. So what was the changing role of government in the New Deal in the 1930s under Franklin Roosevelt? And I think you'll get a really interesting answer to that question tomorrow. So we'll review that tomorrow. Again, our Twitter handle at virtual AP U.S. History, or APUSH, as it's typically known. Thank you again for everyone that tuned in today. Hopefully we'll see you real soon. Be well.